I want to start with one question, which is, how many of you here have read Natchez Burning? All right.
Wow.
How many of you have read The Bone Tree?
None.
Well, it's time. It's time. We're very excited to be here tonight, and I'm excited to get the chance to hopefully try and embarrass Greg for the next 40 minutes.
Right back at
I'm
you.
just kidding. And so we're going to keep this, very relaxed and casual. Talk a little bit about Greg's work, talk about writing in general, and then there is time for questions at the end. So I'm going to start with tell us about your background.
Oh man.
Where are you from? How did this all happen? How did you get started?
I'm one of those guys. People always ask you, when did you first know you wanted to be a writer? And I don't have a moment like that. I just always could write. And when I talk about writing, I tell people, if I told you I could sing, how many seconds would it take for you to tell me if I could sing or not? 5 seconds, 6 seconds, right? Yet somehow we don't think writing is the same kind of talent. But I think it is. I did a panel with Scott Turow and Amy Tan, who were in the band, about whether you can teach writing or whether it's born. And I really believe it's born. I think you can help people get better, but I think having a voice is just something you just have, a combination of genetics and your upbringing or whatever. So anyway, writing was something I always could do, but I didn't really care about doing once I was past, say, 13, writing poems to girls or something, because music was so much more fun. And David is a musician, by the way. When I was walking out of his house last night, he sat down at the piano and started playing Jackson Browne. So, there are a lot of failed musicians in this career. But the thing about playing music, man, is that there's nothing better. You're up in front of 100 or 10,000 people playing some song you wrote, singing harmony, and you can hear a pin drop, and the love is just instantaneous. And writing is just sitting in a room by yourself for a year or two. Who would pick that over the other thing? And so all along, when teachers, a college professor would pull me aside and say, Mr. Iles, stay after class. I'd be like, oh God, And he'd say, I just want you to know you can write. You can write, right? And I'd be like, oh yeah, thanks, whatever. Because I didn't see how it was going to get me girls or anything like that. So what was the point, right? Like John Lennon, he started playing guitar to get girls. But the first year I was married, I was on tour 50 weeks out of 52. And I realized, that wasn't going to work. And I didn't want to get a real job. And I didn't want to go to law school like my buddy David Hudgins here, which probably was a wise thing for him to do. I didn't do it. And so I started doing what I was probably meant to do, and I locked myself in a room 18 hours a day, and, the rest was history. First book was a bestseller, and that was it. I know that sounds easy. It wasn't easy.
When was that? When was your first book?
1993.
How old were you?
33.
Wow.
So, and we can talk about that. We'll go on to other stuff. But, how you sell a book, and everybody always wants to know things like that. And
how did you do it? How did you sell your first book?
Well, I purposefully wrote a novel I knew was commercial, number one. That's a mistake a lot of people make. I knew all the books you buy about writing tell you don't ask agents about money. I broke every rule anybody ever told me, I sent it out to 10 agents I knew represented the kind of stuff that I wrote, and I got a call in like 4 days from a guy in New York, and he was talking so fast I could barely understand him. And the one question I did get out was, how much do you think you can sell this for? And that's a question they said don't ask. And he goes, I don't know, 50,000? And I was just gulped, because I had just lived on like 14,000 for a year, And then I got 8 rejections in a row. Then I got a very nice lady who became my first agent in Portland, Oregon, who's one of those rare literary agents who's just a champion of your work, even if it doesn't sell, right? And she set up an auction. And even that first book, the manuscript was that tall. Wow. And she said, they'll never buy that, so we're going to send out half to all the publishers and see who asks for the second half. And in those days, there were about 32 publishers. Now there's like 4 multinationals on everything. It's a bad time to start out, wow. Because they don't bid against each other like they did back then. So anyway, I'll make this short, but this is a good story if you're trying to be a writer. They set an auction date, and they say, on a given day in 2 months, you may bid on this property, right? But publishers have an opportunity to make a preemptive bid, they call it, right? So here I was, starving artist, and I'm waiting, and the first thing that happens is publishers start dropping out, right? They just say, well, we like it, but it's just not for us. You know that from, pitches, right? So the numbers start shrinking very fast, and I'm like, boy, this is traumatic. And then I get a call from the agent. She says, well, you got an offer today. And I said, well, how much is it? And she said, $10,000. And I was like, take it. Okay. Yeah, I'm a writer. That's all I wanted, right? And she said, I'm advising you, not to take it. And I said, well, if I say no, does that stay on the table? She said, oh, no, if you say no, that's gone, So I just sucked it up and I said no and went on. More publishers dropped out. The date approached. Then I got a call and she said, I got a second offer. It's for $30,000. I was like, okay, that's it. That's enough. I'm done. I'm a writer. Let's go. She goes, I'm really advising you not to take this, And by that time, my wife, my parents, my in-laws, my brother, everyone I knew, are you out of your mind? They're offering you money for something you wrote in your back room. Come on, take it. But I said no. Well, the day came of the auction, and I'm sitting in a little apartment in New Orleans. The phone does not ring. Does not ring. Most of the day goes by. And then, my wife didn't even call. It was like I didn't call the agent. I knew if there was news they would call, But at the end of the day, about, 5 till 5 in New York, she called and said, okay, you've got a deal. And I said, how much? And she said, 2 books, $125,000.
Wow.
And so I went from thinking my whole life had been a waste in one day to, okay, And there'd been like a total of maybe 3 offers right at the last minute. And but the point was, from that point, I just put my head down and went forward. I wrote one more book like the first one set in World War II, and I figured something out then, which was, they want you to basically, like films, they want you to just redo the last thing. Whatever made money the last time, they want you to do that again. And I knew if I kept doing that, that's all I'd ever get to do. So as soon as I could, I veered left and started writing about the South and all these different other genres I've done. And I'm one of the few guys who really gets to do that and consistently makes the list. Michael Crichton used to do it. But most people you read, you'll notice, they're pretty firmly in whatever track they're in. They're writing a series, they're rewriting the last book. And I'm sure I'd be much richer at this moment had I, in 1996, when I wrote that first Penn Cage book, if I just said, well, I'll just write a Penn Cage book every year from now on, But I really took 7 years between each one because I'd put a gun to my head if I had done that. And I've made some other writers mad at writers' conferences. One time, not even knowing this, I won't say who, but there was another writer there, very famous for writing series. First thing I did was get up and slam writing series as, like prostitution, and I've regretted that ever since. Anyway, I'll shut up.
How many books are in the Natchez Burning series? There's 3, right?
Well, there's 3 in the trilogy, but there are 3 that come before.
Right. That's what I meant. In the Natchez Burning going forward, there's 3.
But after we have a huge hit, and you're gonna retrofit those first 3.
Yeah, right. You're going to be writing
to be
another
seasons
one, right?
4, 5,
so
and
be
6.
careful before you disparage series. We might want to go back there.
That's right.
So talk a little bit about your process, and not so much in relation to that first book, but how long does it take you to write a book, and how do you do it?
All right.
How's that for a general question, Greg?
All right, process. This is, I won't sound like other writers that okay? This is what I'll say. Apart from the Natchez Burning trilogy, which really was like a full-time, around-the-clock job for a long time, on most of my books, which tend to be twice as long as other people's thrillers at least, most thrillers are like 90,000 words. My average one runs 180,000. So to do one of those in 1 year is pretty considerable. But I honestly go half a year doing nothing, and I'll tell you why. Because for me, the work is never the writing. The command of the English language is not what being a writer is about. Command of the English language is just a hammer and nails. Okay, any lawyer who can write a good brief has got command of the language. Any English teachers got command of the language in the way that they're choirs all over the country with great singers, but they're not Sting or John Lennon. There's a big difference. So as far as process, ideas can come from something very, very simple or something very complex. I've had a whole novel come from a smile a woman I never saw in my life gave me after one of my kids' soccer matches, to something as complex as a massive conspiracy in World War II in my first novel, or Natchez Burning, which is based on real-life unsolved murders. Ideas come from anywhere. But once you have the idea and you're working with character, and this is LA, the home of the hero's journey and all that, but I actually used that long before it was hip. To me, character really is about those sort of Jungian archetypes, and those are working around in your head from protagonists and antagonists and shapeshifters and your own life. I'll say this, all writers are writing about themselves. I said it. And if they tell you they're not writing about themselves, either they're lying, or B, they don't know they're writing about themselves and they're really screwed up, okay? They need help. All right, so it's one of those things. And here's how I know this, okay? We all have a limited amount of suffering we've been through in our lives, and as a writer, that's your currency. And I know it because I feel like all that real-life experience is a little leather bag of gold nuggets on my hip. And when I dole 1 to 3 of those experiences out in a novel, no matter how I hide it, mask it, whatever I do, a year later when the book comes out, I start getting the emails from Brazil, Iceland, Italy, New Zealand, and they all say, I've never written to an author before, but I cried on page 273, paragraph 4, and every single email is about the same passage in the same book. Why? Because we all recognize genuine human insight, and genuine human insight only comes from genuine suffering, okay? And so that's the other ingredient I'm talking about in that process. So you got your little bag, you've got your whole fictional thing going on in your head, and that's all ginning around in there. And then I compare the moment of starting work to a pregnant woman's water breaking, I'm coaching my kids' football team or whatever it is, bush hogging the lawn, and then bang, man, you just know it's time. I go sit down in the lazy boy with my hospital table and my TV and computer and my tab and my Twinkies and my stuff, and I start working in periods, I kid you not, of 18 to 30 hours at a time. I once did a show with John Grisham in Nevada Bar, and they went around the table and asked, what's a good day? And John, he's a methodical guy, and he would say 5-6 pages, he'll bush hog. He writes in the early morning, and Nevada was a little more than that. And they came to me, and I said, you're not going to believe it, but a good day for me is 30 pages. I've done 40 pages in a day and almost never gone back and changed a word. So that's what I mean, I'm kind of crazy. I wait until it's time, and when it's time, just fanatically put it down. And I think that contributes to the immediacy of the prose when it makes the page, and the immediacy of the flow, And the last insight I'll give you came from my bandmate Stephen King. This is right out of On Writing, which if you want a book on writing, get that one. He said, all writers, think of your head like a house, and the writer's subconscious is like the basement of the house. And in our basements, we got all these unmarked crates sitting down there. And they're unlabeled, but the worst thing you can do as a writer is to try to go down in that basement and organize those crates. The reason is there's already a crew down there working on those crates, and your job is to stay the hell out of the way until they get finished. And that's just another version of what I was saying about my process. That first agent of mine called it passive processing. If you're a writer, the work's getting done, whether you're coaching your kids' thing or watching TV or whatever. I mean, I could be I'm sure I had a couple of epiphanies watching Friday Night Lights, So, anyway.
So that's very interesting to me. So do you rewrite?
Not very much.
What will make you go back and rewrite something?
Well, I'll tell you another thing. I hate to say this on the internet in front of thousands or millions of people or whatever, but I'm going to say it. Most of my books that have gone out and been published as drafts, I would say 6 or 7 of my books are second drafts, maybe first and a half. Thomas Harris spent 7 years on Red Dragon and 7 years on Silence of the Lambs. Those books are like 350 pages. You're writing a book a year, you got 9 months. So I've spent 9 months on a book that's, 650 pages. Think about that. I've almost not put out a single book in 14 or 15 books that was close to the best I could do. And that's sad to say, but I'm in commercial fiction, and it's a business, and it's a business built on a book a year. And I don't know how much I can tell you, but Thomas Harris, after the success of Silence of the Lambs, asked for certain terms, I believe, to give himself adequate time to use his process, and I don't think his original publisher gave him that. Publishers, they want to quantify it and make it a business. And so anyway, I hope the day comes. I wish I could say, oh, Natchez Burning is the one where I took the time and made it perfect. But no. Back in the days when I took 2 years per book, the first 4, I can go back, if I have to do a reading, like the first Penn Cage book, The Quiet Game, I can turn to almost any page and find some beautiful prose. If I want to find it now in these, I know exactly where those pieces are, because it's like when I was with Albert Norris or Tom's flashback, and because it was my dad, I just said, right, I'm going to take the time and I'm going to make this lapidary prose,
You talked about suffering informing your writing. Can you talk a little bit about your accident? And I know that came when weren't you about 200 pages in to Natchez?
I was a week from deadline on the first iteration. My dad had died, so there's some suffering, right? Tom Cage was him. Then I had come to the conclusion that one book would never hold this story. So I knew I was in trouble with the publisher. And I was lying like we always do, about where we are. Grisham pretty much admitted that too, they call, how's it going? Great, halfway through, you don't even have 3 chapters. I mean, that's just the way we all do it, But I knew I was really in trouble. And I was in that state of mind. This is something that's worth thinking about. Some people read these big things and they go, how in the hell do you hold something this complicated in your mind or whatever? And it is not an easy thing. I will say at that point that I had my accident, imagine a person driving around with a big medieval perpetual motion machine spinning in their head, 18 wheels spinning in different directions simultaneously. That's what imagine that's what George R.R. Martin's like all the time, right? You're holding all the 7 kingdoms in your head, or in this, you might need to know everything from what the hero went through in the 3rd grade to some obscure fact in the Civil War to whatever, and you don't know who you are, you don't know where you are, you don't know what day it is. I don't know what year it is when I'm in that kind of frame of mind. And I told my girlfriend at the time, a week before the accident, I made some stupid mistake. I said, I got no business being in a car, driving a car. A week later, I was going to look at paint colors across Highway 61 in the house that I'm in now. And I was in that state of mind, and I pulled out on the 61, and a truck hit my driver's door going 70 miles an hour. So, in that moment, I think my mind was just fully abandoned to the story, and it was like I didn't even exist in that car. I don't remember it hitting me. I woke up 8 days later out of a coma, missing my leg. My aorta was torn, my pelvis was crushed, this leg was crushed, all my ribs were broken. Similar experience again to my bandmate, Stephen King, although he didn't have a car around him when it happened. But so what was the result? The result was, when I came out of that coma, I was in pretty close touch with mortality at that point, right? And I said, I realized I don't have an infinite amount of time to do what I just admitted to you. I've put out a lot of drafts, 2nd drafts, 3rd drafts, and I thought, I don't have time to make this grand statement or whatever. If I'm going to say something, I better start saying it now. So I took what I had. I didn't give whether it sold, what the publisher thought, what the readers thought, what anybody thought. And I didn't think there was a chance in hell it would ever be made for a film, because an 800-page book just doesn't get made into a feature film, right? It didn't even enter my mind. And you know what people say? This is so funny. Is when I'm telling this, they go, oh, see what happens when you follow your bliss, it all turns out great. I'm just like, okay, in short order, I lost my publisher, I lost my agent, I was unemployed, and it's a Jerry Maguire. When you decide you're going to follow the right path, it all goes to hell, trust me, okay? But thankfully, a sort of a white knight stepped in, hadn't even read the book, but they had published me long ago, and they said, if you tell us this is great, We'll take your word for it. We'll not only pay you to do it, we'll pay off your old guys, and you just make it good.
Who was that?
It was William Morrow at HarperCollins, and it was some people who had been at different publishers I'd been at along the way, and that really was sort of a happy ending. But until the book came out, honestly, an 800-page novel with no ending about some of the worst race crimes in American history, that is not a recipe for success right there. Nobody was thinking, yeah, wow, we got a hit here, you know? But then right before I was on Twitter, this thing came out, and there's Ken Follett, who once played with the Rock Bottom Remainders, but I saw it, I wasn't with them. And Ken Follett tweeted, Natchez Burning, best thriller in years. Not best thriller this month or whatever, but I thought, okay, maybe, man, maybe. And then little reviews started happening, and then boom, it debuted at #2 on the Times, and next thing I knew, these guys were calling, and I was like, what in the hell? I didn't even know what was going on. And from then on, it's just been crazy. And the craziest thing is that large numbers of Americans and even Southerners have embraced this thing that is so brutally authentic about violence or whatever. You wouldn't, and David's from Texas, so he knows what I'm talking about. You just wouldn't think people would embrace this book, but they have. So I think that's in the midst of Ferguson and everything that's going on, that's a good sign.
Well, the authenticity is what struck me originally, and I'm actually originally from Mississippi, so when I picked it up and I saw the title and I figured out what it was about, I had a very critical mindset on it, and the book is so damn authentic. And the first line of the book is, you know the first line of the book,
God,
right?
do I know the first? Yeah, about
yeah.
If a man has to choose between the truth and his father, only a fool chooses the truth. Yeah.
That's right. That is what sold this pitch. When I went in and pitched this around town to various cable outlets, I started with that because I think it is very authentic. The racial part of it, which by the way, given what's going on today in Baltimore, I just think it's amazing. But the other thing that struck me about Natchez, and it's interesting because I've never heard you say that before, is I think it's a father-son story. And so your father had died right before you started writing it. Was he a physician?
He's Tom Cage. At least in the first 3 books, it's just him. Now, my dad's sins weren't Tom's sins in the later book, but the principle. The best thing anybody has said about this book, it gave me pure joy, was some reviewer said, imagine Jim Finch grew up to learn things about Atticus that no son should ever know about his father. And to me, that's it. That's where this whole thing is going. And even though it's about a lot of things, man, in the end, we all, if we're lucky, we worship our parents, and guys worship our fathers for a while. And that day, you may be 14, you may be 40, when you learn that they got feet of clay, that can be a bad day, And that's what it's about, coming to terms with the fact that even, look, Henry Fonda and Gregory Peck weren't perfect fathers, when I look at their acting, I sure wish, they were my dad, but that's not reality,
What do you think is the best advice you ever got, career-wise? Or any kind of advice. I won't limit it to that. What do you think? If you think back, what's something that somebody said to you really made an impact on you? That's a tough one, isn't it?
No. John Grisham told me about the film business. Here's what you do, Greg. And this was when he had just sold, I think, a script for $7 million. He said, drive to the California border from Mississippi, hand your book out very tightly with your left hand, snatch the check with your right, drive straight back to Mississippi, and never think about it again. And my first experience in the movie business confirmed all that to a T. And then the other day, before coming to see David and Toby here in LA, I emailed Stephen King and I said, Steve, Grisham once warned me about getting involved in the movie business, and I'm about to exec produce with these guys, and is any words of wisdom from the master? And it goes, Grisham was right. and then he said it's a rush to see the images from your head get put up on the screen. but in the end, it won't be worth the pain and the suffering that you go through. So I hope you prove him wrong.
It's going to be okay, buddy. It's going to be okay, I promise.
Now tell me about your process, seriously.
My
Come
process is completely different because I'm a screenwriter. I mean, first of all, in television, you're all constant deadline. You're constantly feeding a machine, right? Because you have a start date and a prep date and a production date. You don't have the luxury of time in an up and running television series. So by virtue of that, I mean, that's one of the things that makes me want to write a book, is because I feel like you have the time. My process is very similar to yours too, and my wife, who is here, will attest. Half the time it looks like I'm not working because I'm messing around, but you are working. You know, I call it filling the bucket. You know, you got to go out and have experiences and do things and talk to people and make mistakes and live life, or else you have nothing to write about, right? So, I mean, script writing and television is just so different because of the time constraints, and it's much more streamlined, and there is a lot of rewriting that goes on. It's also collaborative. It's very different than than sitting down and writing by yourself, because especially when you're on a show and you've got other writers, you're managing what other people have written, which means oftentimes rewriting them or trying to give them notes so they can rewrite it. So it's very different and very collaborative. But in television, the writer is the boss, which is why I think I gravitated towards it. In film, that's not the case. You know, you turn in your script and they basically kick you to the curb, whereas in TV, the showrunner is the head writer.
Well, let me ask you this, then talk about, say, that process of a writer's room versus like what Nick Pizzolatto did, writing all the True Detectives. Is that attractive to you at all, or you prefer a writer's room?
It scares me. If you don't know what Greg's talking about, Nick wrote all 10 episodes of True Detective, right? DJ, didn't he write all of that? Yeah. So I think about that, and I think about the time and effort it must have taken to do that. I'm assuming there's no way he could have done that. I mean, he must have done that before they started production, because you can't be producing a show and doing that. On the one hand, it's very attractive to me because it's your own baby and your own voice. On the other, I like collaborating because other people have good ideas. You know, a lot of times somebody will say something that makes you think about a character or a story in a way that you never would have thought about it. And a lot of times, especially in my case, they call me on my bullshit and my bad writing. Is if you're not seriously going to do that story, right? I remember pitching the character of a stripper on Friday Night Lights, and everybody thought I was kidding, and I kind of was, but the more that they made fun of me, the more I dug my heels in. I said, this is authentic to Texas, and we ended up putting this character on the show who was a stripper. That was her job. And so the collaborative part of it can be very, when it's going to ultimately be your product, it can be very helpful.
How diplomatic do you have to be in the writer's room in terms of, when you're the showrunner, do you just say, nope, that's it, shut up, move on, or is it more diplomatic?
Well, everybody's different. There are people that have zero diplomacy skills. There are people that are very, I think it just depends on your personal style and what you're like. I mean, I don't think that you get a lot out of somebody by constantly criticizing them, so I try to encourage and be diplomatic. But there is a point in a writer's room where you can identify the writer in the room who's the problem, and that's typically the person who's constantly presenting obstacles and not solutions. Instead of saying, why don't we do this, or what about we do this, the writer that's really the pain in the ass is the one who says, this story isn't working. Well, why not? Give me a reason why not. So you just learn. It's just management, It's just basic. It's people skills. Like in any job, you have to be able to play well with others in the sandbox. And that's especially true in television writing. So, as you will soon discover.
I will be watching from the corner,
yeah,
learning my lessons. So why aren't you home working on the script right now?
Because I'm here with you.
I brought you.
What are you talking about? I'm working on it right now.
That's right.
Tell me about a mistake or a failure, or is there something that you did in your career that you regret? And I don't mean personally. I mean professionally. I mean, as a writer, you don't have to.
Yeah.
Is there something you look back on and go, shit, if I hadn't done that way, it would have been better?
Somebody asked me that the other day, actually, at a book signing. No, not in the strict sense like that. I mean, in all honesty, I don't think I'd be sitting here if I'd made a very bad mistake, because it tends to be pretty unforgiving business. It may not seem like it, But I used to feel like the young guy in this business, and obviously I'm not now. But I remember early in my career going on some talk shows, like you go through Dallas, you know, your town or wherever, and go on some TV, and there'd be some hardcover bestseller there who was higher than me. And man, I haven't heard that guy's name in 15 years, you know. It's like doing a feature that doesn't work. I mean, you're gone, you know. And so if you make too many mistakes, you don't get to the point where I'm sitting here. Mostly what I've done is followed my instinct, and I've dug in my heels and risked everything 2 or 3 times, you know. I turned in a manuscript that a publisher did not want to publish one time, and I had been lying the whole time about what I was writing, and and it was way outside the box. I can't tell the story really in public about what happened, but I'll tell you what I did. The biggest book in the world at the time was The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. You all know what blurbs are, right? Blurbs where you say, oh wow, this book's better than the Bible, and you slap it on there, right? And you think everybody discounts them generally, but in publishing they have weight, right? So I turned in a book my publisher didn't want to publish, and my own agent said, let me tell you a secret, Greg. All the big guys have got one, they just had to put in a drawer. And I'm like, don't you work for me? You know, put in a drawer? I just spent a year of my life doing this, and it's a great book. He goes, you just get your head around it. They don't want to do it, right? I'm like, I'm not doing this. So I called a guy I knew who knew Dan Brown in the publishing business, and I said, whatever you do, he had never given a blurb to anybody, and it was the biggest book in the world, bar none. They guessed they'd made the Tom Hanks deal and everything. And he said, there's no way Dan Brown will look at your manuscript. For God's sake, it's a manuscript. Second, he's moving between houses. Third, he's never given a blurb. Yeah, he goes on, and I said, I am begging you, just send it to his house. I'm telling you, he will like it. And the guy actually did me a favor, and he'd never met me in person. He sent it. But look, weeks go by. I don't get a call. I don't hear anything. I'm in total depression. And then one day, I get a phone, not a phone call, an email, and the guy says, are you by a fax machine? And I'm like, no, but I will get to my fax machine. I go to my fax machine, and out comes a 2-page letter from Dan Brown, and it says, you know, SOB, he said, I was moving between houses, my floor was full of boxes. I made the mistake of opening this box and read the first page of this book, and 3 days later, I quit reading it. And he gives me a paragraph-long blurb, better than something I'd have written myself. So you know what I did? I faxed that straight to New York. Now let me tell you, before this happened, the verdict on the manuscript was, wait for it, unpublishable. Okay, that's like the preface to Give Back the Advance, right? Unpublishable. In 15 minutes, it went from unpublishable to lead title for the spring. Okay? Now, that's the way publishing works. Now, I honestly think most writers probably would have put it in the drawer, you know? So my advice is whenever that negative thing happens, you know, just, you know.
What book was that?
It's called The Footprints of God. And, you know, and the funny thing is it sold better than anything I'd done to that point. And my own agent would say, like, man, that thing is just still selling like crazy. We can't figure it out. We don't know if it's because it has God in it. And I'm like, have you ever thought it's because it's good? You know? And actually, you know what's funny? You talking about hectic lifestyle. I got a call from like Dave Matthews people. Dave Matthews was interested in making movies, and they go, yeah, man, we've read this book, Footprints of God. We want to make it into a movie. I never even called them back. Wow. That's how crazy and weird I am. But anyway, I called you back.
Yeah. How's the book business changed in the last 5 years? Or longer?
It's changed with the advent of, you know, our studio is Amazon Studios, you know. They're going to stream this series. But in all honesty, I mean, Amazon has forever altered the book business, and most of the indies the chains wiped out a lot of the indies that kept the business going initially, and you know, Amazon and the publishers are intermittently at war. So what has essentially happened, I think, is that even though people say, oh, it's this great thing, there's all this unpublished people are now being published online, but all that's really done is create a plethora of sort of noise at the bottom. You know, people who are self-publishing will say, oh, you're just trying to protect the old guard. You know, Scott Turow from our band was president of the Authors Guild for a while, and he took so much flack, you know, oh, he's just trying to protect the old model and protect big advances, but it's really not that simple. And so what you have now is all this self-published stuff at the bottom. You've got guys at the top still doing really, really well, and the middle is just sort of gone. The middle of the business gets gone. I'm not sure why exactly that happens, but what happens is when corporations get scared, they throw money at what they know, and that's the known quantities that sell every year. And so if you're just starting out, the good advice I can give you, the only thing you have on your side is this. Anybody who's sold a lot of books and then sold fewer books the next year or the next year, you're better off than they are. Because at least having sold nothing, you're dragging around no computer baggage behind you when the publisher looks at whatever you're selling them. Okay? So you can be in a good position.
Who do you read? What are some of your favorite books?
I used to read all the time. I don't read much now, partly because I'm old, partly because I'm writing these big bricks. But I used to read all the competition, but I tend to reread, you know. I love classic books like Robert Penn Warren or things like that. Now and then I'll discover somebody new. I like the Master and Commander books, you know. I read a lot of nonfiction. I just basically, the great thing about this job, especially if you can change genres and stuff, or as you do in TV, you can do shows about different things, is you get to, I mean, for God's sake, whatever you happen to be interested in, you can completely immerse yourself in it for a year or two and write a story about that and then just switch gears and go to something else. And you know, writers are people who know a little bit about a whole lot and a lot about nothing, is what I would say. And a little bit OCD tendencies, you know.
Right. Right. Well, you do watch a lot of TV, right? Because I've heard you talk about, what are some of your favorite?
Okay, I do. I've been binge watching just like everybody in here. But I did love True Detective, and I thank Nick and McConaughey and them for changing the paradigm, you know. Some of these shows I love, like Manhattan, you know, set in New Mexico in the 40s. Whoever would have thought they would have made a show about that? You know, I love the Nick with Clive Owen. I mean, the writing on some of these shows blows me away. And can you imagine a novelist ever saying that about television? That's what's changed. 5 years ago, and I'm not downing all television, but in general, television. But I mean, look, I'll say it flat out. Friday Night Lights, Tobey Maguire aside, Toby's a separate, you know, piece in this. He partners with David and me on this, but as far as David being the piece in this, man, I was a huge fan of Friday Night Lights, and I'll tell you why. It is very, very hard to do a show set remotely in the South. Almost all of them have sucked in history, okay? People in the South just look at it and just go, okay, that's not even close to reality. And second, to do a small town, to do simple family things, which is what he's an ace at doing. That's very hard to do for people, because I think of my dad watching medical shows, man, when I was a kid. Something would come on, he'd just go, turn that crap off. You know, a doctor can't watch a medical show, lawyer can't watch a legal show, but we all got families, and you watch a family show and it's bullshit, you know it's bullshit the second you're watching it, right? Yeah. But you watching Kyle Chandler and Connie Britton on that show, man, and you're just like, damn, that is... okay, that's better than, you know, 30-something ever was, right? Nothing against Ed Zwick and those guys.
No. I mean, the authenticity, and I mean, one of the things we did on that show, and Jason Katims did on that show, is we would constantly ask, you would get to a point in a story where the question would become, okay, what would really happen? And I felt like when I read Natchez Burning for the first time, being from Mississippi and having grown up, you know, I mean, I was little, but in the 60s, I remember my grandfather was a preacher in Jackson, Mississippi during the Civil Rights Movement. And when I read your book, there's just moments that you get to in that book where I thought, okay, this is absolutely real. And some of them were really hard moments. Some of them were really tough moments. Some of them were moments where I recognized people that I had known and still know, my cousins, you know, and other people. Oh, wait, this is going out on the internet. Love you guys. See? But you know, so the authenticity, and I couldn't agree more. It's very hard to pull off the South. And so it either becomes a caricature, either becomes Dukes of Hazzard, you know, and so I think that's what's going to be the challenge, but also the great fun about, you know, adapting this is is making it real. And frankly, I think half of the problem is the accent. You know, everybody wants to know, well, you know, are they gonna have accents? It's like, well, I don't know. Are they or are they not? It depends on if they're good or bad.
The thing he and I kind of talked about, and I think it's the way to go, it's like Friday Night Lights. Less is more.
Right.
You know, I mean, if somebody really has a Southern accent, okay, great. But if somebody doesn't, don't try to have it. Just, you know, be natural, be yourself. Man.
Right. You still live in Natchez, right? Just
Yeah.
so everybody
yeah.
knows.
My son's about to graduate from high school, and I've stuck it out in Natchez a long time, and I love it. It's one of the most beautiful places in the world. But it is, you know, it's shrinking like a lot of little towns in the South. And I've done things to try to, you know, save it. I mean, I don't take credit for trying to save it, but I just spent a month and a half of my life rewriting something that began 83 years ago called it began as the Confederate Pageant, okay? Pretty much an unapologetic celebration of the slaveholding. First 20 minutes of Gone with the Wind, you know? It's sort of a reenactment of that by the whole community. And my daughter was going to be queen. She's a history major at Millsaps College, and she said, I'm not going to be a queen of this unless it tells both the black side and the white side. And because it had lost money for a number of years, they agreed to let me come in and rewrite it. And they said, you got any ideas about rewriting? And I said, oh yeah, I got some ideas. But I said, you better be sure you won't change before you get me on this thing. And in a month and a half, I took that thing to a 50% black cast, totally musical. I cut the tracks, got friends to cut tracks. We did everything from music from slave times all the way through Sam Cooke, man. It was black choir up there at the end. And so what you see is this weird schizophrenic thing from the Confederate side and the black side at the time. You know, a secret slave wedding, jump in the broom with dogs chasing and crazy stuff. Wow. But it made money for the first time in like 6 years. And so I'm doing things like that to try to help, you know, my hometown. But I'll also say at a certain point, you get tired and you go, okay, my kids aren't going to be there. Maybe it's time to look around. Yeah. I shouldn't have said that on the internet, but I just did.
I think it's time we can open up if anybody has
If you have
any
a
questions.
question, raise your hand and I'll bring a microphone to you.
I did go to Natchez because of your books.
Wow.
And second of all, do you think you'll ever write another book like Black Cross or The Footprints of God? Because they were great. I love the Natchez stuff, but those first couple of stories, everybody that's read them, it's just like, can't put it down.
Well, my point I meant to get to about Black Cross when he was asking about process, that's probably the best book I ever wrote, probably the most cinematic book, most emotionally powerful, and I wrote most of that book in 90 days and almost did not change a single word at all. So I think that's the value of that sustained sort of process. Will I do it again? I actually have one plotted out set in late World War II. I'm sure my publisher would prefer I didn't, but yeah, I might do that.
Got it. So John Grisham gave you this great advice, and here you are now. You're going to be an executive producer, is that right?
Yeah, whatever the title is.
Whatever the title is. So, you know, in the old days, I don't think authors really had so much of that option to even be involved in their project. It was like you just sold the rights and cried yourself to sleep after, I guess, you know. But now you do have that option, and I know in particular because I'm a big comic book reader, and so with Robert Kirkman, for example, with The Walking Dead, he's an executive producer, he writes the episodes, he's very involved, and he looked at this as an opportunity to like almost rewrite the story. Like if he could write The Walking Dead over again, these are the things that he would do. So what is your idea for Natchez Burning and the trilogy and the TV version?
Well, I'm going to wait and see what David does, number one, because I trust him totally. Like he asked me early on, was I interested in writing episodes? And I said I really wasn't. You know, I mean, I took my stab. Now that we've gotten into it a little bit and we're looking at things like seasons, I have a little of that feeling you're talking about. In the sense, I'll tell you that the Bone Tree digresses a bit from the A story, the father-son story he's talking about. And so I sort of see, well, depending on how he structures it and how many seasons, I could see a way you could stick more to that primary story, take a few of the major events out of the second one and preserve them elsewhere. So that do-over thing is a temptation probably for every writer. Because as I said, they're never perfect. I guess maybe Tolstoy or Faulkner thought that he had done perfect. But
We had a discussion during the pitch process on this project about a change to the book that I proposed, and I thought long and hard about it before I actually emailed Greg, and I waited to email him until it was kind of late at night. So if he was awake, he might receive it in the best possible frame of mind. And you know, so that's one of the things about adapting something to television, is that there are certain things that are required for that medium as opposed to the novel. And so I'm sure for Greg it's very hard to have your work looked at in that way, but it's also part of the process, and we have the same goal, which is to make a show that can really be, and by the way, I talked about this in pitching it, and it was hard to do this in a way without feeling a little bit like a, what's the word? Like a tool, like a douche, because I would go in and I would say, this show is really important. It really has something to say, and if we can do this in the right way, it has a chance to get on the air and make a statement about this country and the way things are in this country that I think can be very powerful. It's hard to say that unless you really believe it, and I really believe it. And so, you know, one of the reasons that, one of the aces we have in our favor in this project is that Greg is involved. You know, he could very well have easily said, you know, here you go with God, and taken his check and run like a thief in the night. I didn't want him to do that because I think he's a great storyteller, and when he sent me his, what do you call that thing, the color-coded character map or whatever it was?
Oh yeah, I don't know.
He sent me this thing and I was like, oh my God, it was like 18 pages of every OCD, like, you know, maps of characters and blah, blah, blah. I was like, yeah, we definitely need Greg around on this project.
Yeah, he had asked for like a little help with the outline or something for pitching. Did I have anything? And crazily, I did have this thing, and yeah, that's usually not me, but for a book this big, you got to have a map, right. You know.
Greg, I grew up in the South, and I agree with you that it seems hard for people to get the South right. Is that true of all the regions, do you think? If you grew up in the Midwest, you think it's hard to get the Midwest right, or is there something about the South that makes it elusive?
Well, every region is its own little universe, obviously, and all the regions of the country have produced unique authors to that region. But I think the South, without sounding pretentious, is the South is very much a microcosm of America, and the difficulty is this. It's the sort of the idea of exceptionalism. During the worst period of race problems in the country, it was very easy to point at places like Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, and say, oh, look how terrible that is, okay? As if the problem is somehow contained down in this little area. But here's the truth about the South. Yeah, there was racism in the South, but the thing is, it wasn't hypocrisy. It was right out there in the open. Yeah, you know, we don't want them going to school with us. That's how we like it, you know. People like Charles Evers would tell you they'd rather deal with somebody like that and know where they're coming from than be in the North and deal with somebody who secretly resents them or looks down upon them. You know, in his biography, Charles Evers said, in politics, he was talking about Lyndon Johnson. He said, I would trust a Southerner who was completely against everything I believed in before I would trust a Northerner, and here's why. If he gave me his word, I knew I could believe it. He would fulfill what he said. If a Northerner gave me his word, I could only hope that he wouldn't get advice to the contrary in the meantime. So it's complicated, and we're going to be navigating a minefield doing this thing. We can't kid ourselves. Every decision is fraught with overtones, and you can't, not only can you not please everybody in this subject, you can't please almost anybody, okay? We're going to have to deal with the N-word. We're going to be dealing with the Klan. You know, we're going to be dealing with, you don't have enough black characters. Oh, you're making this black character look bad. You know, we're going to be guilty of everything. But you want to know how complicated the South is? I'm just going to tell this story. It's short and unbelievable. I'm in Tupelo, Mississippi, home of Elvis. I'm signing books, and people coming through the line, and you know, I'm easy. I just write whatever they say, from best wishes to the hottest weekend I ever had, whatever. You know, whatever you want, man, I'll write it. So I look up, and there's two African-American ladies. They're like 30 and 40. I'm just guessing. I don't know. And I start to write, and I look at the thing, and it says, to my biggest colored fans. And I start to write, and I go, I feel this little hiccup in there, and I'm like, is this like a trap? You know, I could see it on YouTube like 5 minutes later, you know, to my biggest colored fans. And I looked up and I said, ladies, it's 2000, this was last year, and I said, 2014, I don't think I can write to my biggest colored fans. And she goes, oh, no, baby, this book's about the 60s. You got to write it to my biggest colored fans. I said, yeah, I started to, and I still said, I just don't think I can do that. And she goes, then she got very serious, and she looked at me, she said, listen, my good friend is from down in Natchez. And back in the 60s, she broke her leg. And your daddy was the only doctor who would come out to their house and set that leg. She said, now you write that what I said. And I just wrote it out to my biggest colored fans. Now why? Why does that make a difference? You know what I say? If that's what they want, that's what they wanted, and who am I to, instruct them on political correctness, okay? So we're never going to be right when we make these choices. You guys make these choices, but we're going to make them, and we're going to make them in the best faith we can, and let the fucking chips fall, man. I don't care.
Well, you made them. They're made in the book. And now it's up to us to put them on the screen. And that's, but again, the authenticity of it is what attracted to me about it. I think there's such an assumption of provincialism with Southerners. I think people think that Southerners are provincial and dumb. And I'm not going to name a name.
Tell the pitch
during
story,
the process of this pitch, a certain person in town, as I was pitching Penn Cage and all these other people, he looked at me and said, well, when do we get to the part where we find out they're really racist? And I said, Penn Cage isn't a racist, he's a hero. He said, what? I said, yeah, Penn's a hero, Henry's a hero, all these guys are heroes, and they're smart, and we're going to be rooting for them. And he said, well, if they're so smart, why are they still in Mississippi? And I sort of, said, I don't think we're going to sell it here. And I moved on. And I just think that's indicative of an attitude that a lot of people have. One of the things I wanted to say, actually, is the classic thing of when you come up with a comeback 2 days later. What I should have said to that guy was what you said, which is, well, why would you leave? How are you going to affect change if you leave? So it was a very signal moment for me that sort of made me realize that there is a mindset out there that, that's going to be one of the challenges of the material. But hey, we could go just write episodes of Full House or something, or we could do this. This will be better.
That's right, man.
You give kudos to Stanley Nelson. Right now, they're still fighting a fight down there, and uncovering and discovering unsolved civil rights cases and murders and all that. And how much is life imitating art right now? I mean, have you run into any issues with any of your books that have come out? I mean, a lot of your characters are similar to real life people there, and a lot of those, are experienced firsthand, things that happened in Natchez in that region. I mean, are you getting any real life fallout? I know Stanley Nelson does.
You know what's funny is that it's not the reaction you'd think. One of the worst villains I ever created was a judge in The Quiet Game in the first Penn Cage book. And he was based on a real guy, and I can say this because the guy's dead now. But what's funny is that guy who was a Mississippi he was partly based on that guy. He was a Mississippi Supreme Court justice, and you know what he did? He actually went around the state bragging that the guy was based on him, and he was this evil, horrible character, So you never know how people are. It's like they want any brush with fame. But the more serious level of your question, a reviewer once said that I do Natchez the backhanded favor of setting my novels there, Here's what happened. When I wrote The Quiet Game, that was sort of a Valentine to the bucolic 70s Natchez I grew up in. That wasn't that way for black people, but, it was wonderful for our side. But then I got to Seattle, Washington on that book tour, and a guy walked up and said, my wife and I, we love that book so much, we drove all the way to Natchez. And I was like, oh my God. And I thought, if people are going to do this, I got to start telling the truth, And so you'll see Natchez sort of become grittier, and you'll hear the realities about it in the area. And so once I started doing that, not everybody's happy, when I say they let me rewrite this thing, there were a lot of people against me doing that because they knew what I would do. But it's not, if anything's exaggerated in the trilogy, Dave and I talked about this. Look, the stuff that's from the past in that book, it really was that bad. The stuff that's in the present is somewhat exaggerated. I mean, watch the headlines, the terrible stories you see. I mean, what are you watching? Ferguson and Baltimore and New York and whatever. You're not seeing Jackson, Mississippi and Selma, Alabama, whatever, you know. The black-white thing, people just still, they don't get it, you know. One thing about the South is that you don't have to go back far to realize that in a single Mississippi county in the Delta, there are more black people than like 8 or 9 states in the North, okay? At least in the South, we knew black people and we lived with them, you know? It was unfair and unequal, but as people, we knew each other, you know? It's easy to be noble and holier than thou when you're not dealing with the problem at all. But as soon as World War II came and the migrations sent large numbers of African Americans north to compete for jobs, racism exploded in Boston and Detroit and everywhere else, you know. So I hope what we can get to here is racism is a universal, not a Southern problem. Ted, can I end with one thing or just say one thing? Here's the thing I want to most quote, and I hope you get it in the show. In 1964, when Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman disappeared, and one of the largest manhunts in American history started, a not-so-funny thing happened, okay? And that is, on the 21st day, a body washed up on the other side of the state in the Mississippi River. The next day, another body washed up. And for about 24 hours, there was a flurry of frantic communications between Mississippi and Washington and the FBI because they thought the civil rights workers had been found. Then it was discovered that the 2 guys found on the river were both black, just 2 young black guys. And as soon as that fact was known, the spotlight went right back to Neshoba County, and those crimes weren't solved for 40 years. You know why? Because those 2 guys were black. And in Neshoba County, Schwerner and Goodman were white college kids who'd come south to work the civil rights movement. And it isn't that just nobody in Mississippi cared about the 2 black guys in the river. Nobody in North Dakota or Manhattan or anywhere else raised much of a fuss either, okay? So the bottom line is the idea that black lives, that black males are sort of second-class citizens, that is not a new thing, and it is not unique to the South. You know, it's just a reality we're going to have to find our way around and a way to fix. Now I'll quit preaching and shut up.
Are you going to film the show in Natchez?
Well, I hope so. I'll leave it.
That is the plan. That is the plan, and was always all along, because you know, authenticity being a buzzword of the project. Yes, you know, I think that would be a fantastic idea. Now, of course, you know, there's tax credit issues and stuff that you have to deal with studios on, but Mississippi gets a lot of production, so I think it's something that we should definitely try to do.
The day he calls me and tells me they're filming it on the back lot, he's going to have to wait really late to call me and tell me.
That won't happen. That won't happen. We're gonna be down there. We're gonna be down there. It's gonna be great.